There is a specific shade of blue used in the opening frame of Paw Patrol, the Dino movie, that feels almost absurdly familiar. It is bright, clean, uncomplicated blue, the kind of blue that seems designed to survive a television screen in a bedroom while a child is still waking up. And if you spent your childhood, or your younger sibling years, or those strange babysitting years when you somehow knew every Paw Patrol character by name, that blue can feel like a doorway. You see it, and suddenly you remember plastic. Not metaphorical plastic either. Actual molded plastic. The slightly hollow sound of a toy vehicle hitting a bedroom floor. The tiny wheels that never rolled quite straight. The rescue badges, the little pup figures, the oversized command center, the shelf that slowly became less of a shelf and more of an unofficial headquarters. You remember the Saturday morning rhythm before you even remember the plot. Wake up, find the television, hear the theme song, watch a problem appear, watch Ryder explain the mission, watch the pups deploy, watch everything go wrong for exactly long enough to make the rescue exciting, and then watch everything return to normal. That repetition was the point. Paw Patrol did not originally need to surprise you every week. It needed to reassure you. It created a world where problems were colorful, emergencies were manageable, adults were mostly absent, and competence was always available at the push of a button. For a preschool audience, that kind of predictability is not a creative failure. It is comfort architecture. The world outside a child's bedroom can be loud, confusing, and impossibly large. Paw Patrol made that world small enough to understand. Someone needs help. Someone has a vehicle. Ryder knows what to do. The pups have a job. The problem gets solved. Then everybody goes home. That is an extraordinarily powerful formula when you are 4 years old, because at 4, a formula is not boring. A formula is safety. And yet Paw Patrol, the Dino movie, arrives in a cultural moment where that original simplicity feels strangely distant. The franchise is no longer just a television property sitting between cartoons and toy commercials. It has become a recognizable piece of childhood infrastructure. Children who once watched the pups as background noise are now old enough to remember them. Parents who once tolerated the theme song now hear it as an artifact of family life. Older siblings who thought the whole thing was ridiculous may suddenly realize they can identify every vehicle from across a room. That is where this movie becomes more interesting than its premise suggests. Because the question is not simply whether Paw Patrol can make a dinosaur adventure entertaining. Of course it can. The more revealing question is what happens when a franchise built around repetition, reassurance, and brightly colored plastic has to confront something enormous, ancient, and visually overwhelming. Dinosaurs are not just another rescue obstacle. They carry a completely different emotional charge. They represent deep time, extinction, mystery, physical scale, and the terrifying realization that the world existed long before we did. Putting them into Paw Patrol changes the emotional physics of the universe. Suddenly the pups are not just responding to a lost kitten or a runaway vehicle. They are standing next to creatures that make their familiar machines look tiny. And if you grew up with this franchise, that contrast can hit harder than expected. You are not only watching the pups become bigger. You are watching your own childhood entertainment become bigger with them. That is the strange trick at the center of this movie. It asks preschoolers to look forward while quietly asking adults to look backward. The first audience sees an exciting dinosaur spectacle. The second sees evidence of time passing. You may remember when these characters seemed new. You may remember the toys taking over living rooms, daycare centers, birthday parties, and shopping aisles. You may remember thinking that the franchise would always look exactly like that, plastic, glossy, cheerful, and permanently locked inside childhood. But childhood does not stay locked. The child changes. The toys disappear into boxes. The television gets replaced. The bedroom gets repainted. The little figures become things you find years later while cleaning out a closet. The franchise, however, keeps moving. That is why the opening image matters. It is familiar enough to lower your defenses before the movie begins asking you to notice how different everything has become. And the difference is not only visual. The colors are richer. The environments are larger. The camera moves with more confidence. The stakes are louder. The music has more weight. The dinosaurs occupy the frame with a physical presence that television Paw Patrol could rarely afford. Even the idea of danger feels expanded. Yet underneath all of that sophistication is the same fundamental promise: when the world becomes frightening, somebody will show up. That promise is probably why this franchise lasted. It was never really selling children a fantasy of independence. It was selling them a fantasy of reliable competence. You could be scared because someone else knew what to do. You could imagine yourself as Chase, Marshall, Skye, Rocky, Rubble, or any of the others because each pup represented a particular kind of useful ability. The fantasy was not that problems disappear. The fantasy was that problems can be answered. The Dino movie takes that old reassurance and places it inside a much larger visual machine. The result is sometimes ridiculous, sometimes commercially transparent, occasionally surprisingly beautiful, and far more culturally revealing than a movie about talking rescue dogs has any right to be. That bright plastic aesthetic was never simply an accident of cheap design. It was the result of a meticulously calculated industrial pipeline, and once you understand the machine behind the colors, the entire franchise starts to look different. Spin Master's achievement with Paw Patrol is easier to underestimate than to explain. From the outside, the business model seems almost comically obvious. Create memorable characters, put them into recognizable vehicles, build stories around repeatable rescue scenarios, and make toys that children can physically own. But obvious is not the same thing as simple. The real accomplishment is coordination. Paw Patrol became a system in which television, licensing, retail, character design, merchandising, live experiences, theatrical releases, and consumer recognition reinforce one another. The screen teaches the child what matters. The toy lets the child reproduce it. The toy increases attachment to the character. The character increases recognition of the show. The show creates another reason to buy the toy. It is a loop, but it is a remarkably efficient one. And when you are an adult looking back at the franchise, that commercial architecture can make it tempting to dismiss everything else. You see the products first. You see the shelves. You see the branded backpacks, pajamas, lunchboxes, figures, vehicles, bedding, birthday decorations, and endless variations on the same recognizable faces. You think, this is obviously a machine designed to sell things. And yes, it is. Pretending otherwise would be dishonest. But there is an important distinction between understanding commercial design and reducing the entire cultural experience to commerce. A toy pipeline only works if children care about the characters. A character only becomes valuable if the child can recognize a personality, a voice, a color, a vehicle, a role. That means the supposedly disposable details have to be extremely memorable. The franchise needs a visual language so clear that a child can understand it before they can read. Blue means one thing. Pink means another. The badge shape matters. The vehicle silhouette matters. The pup's job matters. The repeated catchphrase matters. The music matters. Even the way a character enters the frame becomes part of a memory system. What looks like repetition from an adult perspective can function as literacy for a preschooler. The child is learning how to navigate a fictional world. That is why the toys matter beyond their sales figures. They transform a passive viewing experience into physical play. The television says, "Here is a rescue." The toy says, "Now you can do it." And that distinction is enormous. The franchise does not simply give children characters to watch. It gives them a modular system for storytelling. You can put the pups in different vehicles. You can invent a rescue that never happened on television. You can make Chase the hero even if you usually prefer Skye. You can crash the vehicles together, rebuild them, separate them, and start again. The commercial machine and the imaginative machine are therefore not identical, even when they are deliberately connected. This is where the adult viewer can hold two thoughts at once. Yes, Paw Patrol is aggressively commercial. Yes, its products are part of its identity. And yes, the people designing this ecosystem understood exactly how to make children remember things. But that does not automatically make the emotional response fake. A child can genuinely love something that was engineered to be lovable. Those ideas are not opposites. In fact, most modern children's culture works this way. The industrial system creates the object, but the child creates the memory. A corporation can manufacture a toy. It cannot fully manufacture the moment a child decides that toy belongs beside the pillow at bedtime. It can create a television episode. It cannot dictate the exact day that episode becomes associated with a parent's voice, a particular breakfast, a rainy morning, or a sibling laughing in the next room. That is the strange alchemy of commercial childhood. The machine creates the ingredients. Human beings create the memories. Paw Patrol's industrial logic becomes even more fascinating when you consider how consistently the franchise maintains recognizable roles. This is not a universe built around endless ambiguity. It is built around specialization. Each pup has a function, and that function is easy to identify. The child can instantly understand who is useful in a given situation. That clarity is incredibly valuable for both storytelling and merchandising because it allows the same character to operate in multiple contexts without losing identity. A rescue dog is not just a personality. It is a role, a color, a vehicle, a sound, a costume, and a product category. The character becomes a bundle of associations. That sounds cold until you realize that children naturally think in bundles. They do not separate the character from the object as cleanly as adults do. Chase is not merely a fictional police pup. Chase can also be the figure sitting on the carpet. Chase can be the backpack. Chase can be the voice coming from the television. Chase can be the character a child pretends to be while running through the house. The industrial machine is therefore unusually good at turning fiction into ritual. And ritual is where childhood attachment becomes durable. The most successful children's franchises do not simply occupy screen time. They occupy routines. They become part of getting ready, eating breakfast, traveling in the car, choosing clothes, negotiating bedtime, and deciding what toy comes along on a trip. By the time a theatrical film arrives, the franchise is not entering a blank cultural space. It is entering a memory that may already be years old. That changes the meaning of spectacle. A larger movie is not just an upgrade. It is a declaration that the characters have graduated from the television screen without abandoning the world that made them familiar. This is where the previous cinematic adventures matter. The franchise had already tested what happens when the pups are given more screen time, larger environments, bigger emotional arcs, and theatrical pacing. Adventure City demonstrated that the basic formula could survive outside the short, highly controlled television structure. The cinematic format gave the characters room to breathe, but it also exposed the limitations of their original grammar. Television Paw Patrol was designed around quick recognition and rapid resolution. Cinema asks for atmosphere, escalation, visual rhythm, emotional payoff, and a stronger sense of place. The pups could no longer simply arrive, solve, and leave. The world had to become a character itself. Adventure City provided that bridge. Suddenly streets could stretch beyond the frame. Buildings could tower over the pups. The camera could move through space instead of merely presenting a sequence of readable actions. The franchise was learning how to think in cinematic terms. And now the Dino movie pushes that evolution further. Everyone dismisses preschool intellectual property as mindless noise, but the production logic behind a franchise like this can reveal a kind of rigid precision that rivals much larger world-building projects. The comparison may sound absurd until you look at what has to remain consistent. Characters must retain their recognizable personalities. Their vehicles must remain legible. Their technology must feel compatible with the established world. Their scale must make sense. Their color identities must survive more complex lighting. The audience must know who is who instantly, even while the film introduces new locations, new creatures, and new threats. That requires a visual Bible and an extraordinary amount of coordination. The challenge is not making something complicated. The challenge is making something complicated while keeping it understandable to a 4-year-old. That is a different kind of craft. The Dino movie understands that scale can create novelty without abandoning familiarity. The pups still look like the pups. Their silhouettes remain friendly. Their eyes remain expressive. Their personalities remain accessible. But the environments around them become more imposing. The prehistoric setting gives the filmmakers permission to expand everything. A canyon can feel enormous. A dinosaur can fill the screen. A landscape can stretch into the horizon. The rescue vehicles can become points of movement against environments that dwarf them. And that visual contrast does something psychologically important. It makes competence feel earned. When Chase races down a familiar-looking street, his vehicle already feels powerful because we know what it can do. Put that same character beneath the shadow of a gigantic prehistoric creature, and the meaning changes. He is still competent, but now competence exists inside vulnerability. That is one of the quiet ways the franchise has matured. The pups have not suddenly become morally complicated characters. They have become characters who exist inside larger spaces. Their courage is more visible because the world around them is more intimidating. That evolution also explains why the dinosaur premise feels less random than it initially appears. Dinosaurs are one of the few childhood fascinations that seem almost universal. Long before a child understands extinction, geological time, or evolutionary history, they understand one simple idea: there were once enormous animals here that are gone now. That fact is both thrilling and haunting. Dinosaurs are proof that the world can change completely. They are ancient monsters that are also real. They belong to science, but they function like mythology. A child can learn about a Tyrannosaurus Rex and feel the same imaginative charge they feel from a dragon, except the dinosaur existed. That combination of reality and fantasy makes paleontology unusually powerful as childhood play. You can hold a plastic dinosaur in your hand and imagine an entire vanished world. You can build landscapes out of blankets and blocks. You can decide which creature is dangerous and which is friendly. You can turn scientific names into characters. The fascination is endless because deep time gives the imagination room to expand. Paw Patrol already understands the appeal of transforming functional objects into imaginative identities. The pups have jobs, vehicles, tools, and badges. Dinosaurs introduce another layer: ancient ecology. Suddenly the rescue problem is not only about machinery and urban infrastructure. It is about an environment that existed before human systems did. The pups are entering a world they cannot fully control. That matters because the emotional logic of dinosaurs is fundamentally different from the emotional logic of city rescues. A broken bridge can be repaired. A runaway vehicle can be stopped. A giant prehistoric animal does not care about your emergency procedures. It is simply there. That creates unpredictability. And unpredictability is useful for a franchise whose original appeal depended so heavily on predictability. The dinosaur becomes a way of testing the old promise. Can the pups still solve the problem when the problem does not fit neatly into their usual categories? The answer, importantly, is not always about overpowering the threat. A good dinosaur story depends on understanding behavior, environment, movement, and scale. That creates opportunities for the pups to use their established strengths in new ways. Skye's aerial perspective becomes more valuable when the landscape expands. Rocky's resourcefulness can feel different when technology has to interact with unfamiliar terrain. Rubble's construction abilities become less like a simple gag and more like genuine environmental problem-solving. Marshall's comic clumsiness becomes more effective when the consequences of movement are physically larger. These are still recognizable characters, but the prehistoric setting forces their functions to operate under different conditions. That is what makes the premise work. It is not simply Paw Patrol plus dinosaurs. It is Paw Patrol forced to rethink its own problem-solving grammar. And beneath that is something even more interesting, the psychology of deep time. Children naturally struggle to understand enormous quantities. A million years is almost meaningless when you are 4. So dinosaurs become a physical shortcut for the concept of unimaginable age. They are a way of asking a child to look beyond the immediate world. The city outside the window is not the whole planet. The people in the room are not the beginning of history. The Earth existed before the characters, before the buildings, before the toys, before us. Even when a movie does not explicitly lecture about that idea, the imagery communicates it. A dinosaur moving through a landscape carries the suggestion that the world is older than the systems we built on top of it. That gives the film a subtle thematic opportunity. Paw Patrol has always been about control. The pups arrive with equipment, procedures, plans, and specialized skills. Dinosaurs introduce a world that existed before control. That tension gives the movie a reason to exist beyond merchandising. The franchise needs a new environment that can challenge the assumptions of its own formula, and prehistory provides one. With the structural foundations laid, the reason for this specific formula becomes clearer. The franchise needed to unearth something older, heavier, and far more intimidating. The dinosaurs are not merely larger toys. They are visual instruments for making the pups feel small. And making the pups feel small is exactly what allows the movie to make them feel brave. This is where the technical craft becomes impossible to ignore. The central visual challenge is deceptively simple. How do you make stylized rescue pups coexist convincingly with prehistoric creatures without making either side look like it belongs to a different movie? The answer lies in scale, lighting, texture, camera movement, and a careful understanding of how realism should be distributed. The filmmakers do not need the pups to become photorealistic. In fact, that would probably destroy what makes them recognizable. Their faces need to remain expressive. Their proportions need to retain the exaggerated friendliness of the franchise. Their fur cannot become so detailed that the characters look like documentary animals. The dinosaurs, however, can carry much more physical texture. Their skin can show wrinkles, folds, scars, dust, moisture, and subtle variations in surface. The environment can become richly layered with vegetation, rock, atmospheric haze, and particulate detail. The result depends on contrast. The pups remain stylized islands of familiarity inside a more tactile world. That contrast is not a flaw. It is the visual language. Imagine the difference between looking at a toy dinosaur in a bedroom and suddenly seeing that creature occupy a landscape where every footstep displaces dirt. The emotional response changes because physical consequences become visible. The dinosaur has weight. The environment reacts to it. The camera feels low enough to make the creature imposing. Light catches the contours of its body. Dust hangs in the air after it moves. The pup beside it looks small, but not unreal. This is where virtual cinematography becomes essential. Animation does not have to obey the physical limitations of a live-action camera, but great animation often pretends that it does. The filmmakers can choose lens behavior, camera height, depth of field, motion blur, framing, and lighting direction to create a sense that the viewer is physically present. When the camera drops close to the ground, the dinosaur becomes taller. When it moves behind the pup becomes a foreground anchor. When the camera pulls back, the landscape suddenly reveals its scale. These decisions manipulate your perception before you consciously analyze them. A particularly effective technique is scale contrast. Put a small pup against a huge rock formation, and the rock becomes a measurement device. Put the pup beside a dinosaur leg, and the body of the dinosaur becomes architecture. Put both in a wide shot, and suddenly the rescue feels like an expedition. The film does not have to tell you that the world is enormous. It shows you. The rendering work behind that effect is equally important. A television production can communicate a forest with a handful of recognizable shapes and colors because the viewer is processing the image quickly. A theatrical film has more room for visual density. Leaves can overlap. Rocks can have irregular surfaces. Shadows can soften with distance. Fog can separate foreground from background. Light can change across a sequence. Those details create depth. They also create the illusion that the environment continues beyond the edge of the frame. That matters because cinema is partly about convincing the audience that the world is larger than what the camera happens to show. The Dino movie uses that principle to transform the Paw Patrol aesthetic from a bright television diagram into a cinematic environment. The old visual language is still there, but it is surrounded by more information. The colors have more gradation. The shadows carry more atmosphere. The highlights feel less like flat graphic shapes and more like surfaces reacting to light. Even the familiar vehicles can feel different when they are placed in dirt, mud, dust, rain, or nighttime environments. Their bright colors become visual anchors. You always know where the characters are because the franchise has trained you to recognize them. But now that recognition operates inside a more sophisticated visual field. That is a clever way to modernize a preschool property. Instead of redesigning the characters beyond recognition, the filmmakers upgrade the world around them. The pups remain emotionally accessible while the environment grows more complex. It is a little like looking at an old childhood toy after years away from it and discovering that your adult eyes notice details your child eyes never could. The object has not necessarily changed as much as you have. The lighting is different because your perception is different. And the same thing happens here. The film gives the familiar characters a more cinematic context, and suddenly you can see the architecture that was always underneath them. The rendering farm hours required for individual dinosaur textures may be a dramatic shorthand for this leap, but the larger point is real within the logic of modern animation. Visual complexity is expensive because every surface, light interaction, simulation, and frame has to be calculated. When a dinosaur's skin has convincing texture, when dust responds to movement, when vegetation bends, when light filters through atmospheric layers, the computer is doing an enormous amount of invisible work. Most viewers never notice it directly, and that is precisely why it works. The goal of technical craft is often to disappear. You should not watch a dinosaur and think about the renderer. You should think, that thing feels heavy. You should not watch a canyon and think about geometry. You should think, that place feels huge. You should not watch a pup running through mud and think about simulation. You should think, I can believe this character is actually there. That illusion is the achievement. And yet technical sophistication alone cannot carry a movie like this. Scale and lighting can trick the eye, but the heart of the film rests on a script walking a perilous tightrope between toddler logic and adult irony. This is the real dual audience challenge. A 4-year-old does not need the same things from the story that a 30-year-old does. The child needs clarity, movement, recognizable characters, emotional reassurance, and enough novelty to maintain attention. The adult needs rhythm. They need jokes that acknowledge the ridiculousness of talking rescue dogs without making the child feel like the joke is being made at their expense. They need visual details that reward looking away from the center of the frame. They need emotional beats that are sincere enough to land but not so manipulative that they feel like a commercial break wearing a sad face. The best family animation understands this balance intuitively. It does not write one movie for children and another for parents. It writes one movie with multiple frequencies. A child hears the obvious joke. An adult notices the timing. A child sees a dinosaur chase. An adult notices that the chase is staged like an action sequence. A child laughs when a familiar character falls over. An adult laughs because the filmmakers know exactly how long to hold the shot before the character recovers. That difference is what keeps parents in the room emotionally. Because let's be honest, if you have ever watched a preschool movie repeatedly, you know the real enemy is not simplicity. It is repetition without invention. Children can watch the same thing 20 times. Adults cannot. So a movie designed for families needs to contain layers that reveal themselves through repetition. A background character might perform a tiny visual gag. A sign might contain a joke. A camera move might parody an action film. A line might carry one meaning for the child and another for the adult. None of this needs to be cynical. In fact, the best version of the technique is affectionate. It says, yes, we know you are an adult sitting here. We also know you came because someone you love wants to watch this. We are not going to punish you for that. We are going to give you something to notice. The Dino movie benefits enormously from this approach because dinosaurs themselves are shared cultural property. Parents remember dinosaurs. Children love dinosaurs. Older siblings recognize dinosaur movie conventions even when the pups are doing the saving. That creates an unusually broad bridge between generations. The film can borrow the language of prehistoric adventure without requiring adults to abandon their memories of Paw Patrol. It can stage a giant reveal with orchestral music while still letting a pup deliver a perfectly timed joke. It can create genuine suspense and then puncture it with physical comedy. That rhythm matters because preschool storytelling is often misunderstood as constant stimulation. Good preschool storytelling is actually about predictable emotional cycles. Excitement rises. Tension appears. The audience gets a laugh. The threat returns. A character feels uncertain. Someone finds a solution. Relief arrives. The child learns that fear has an ending. Adults can recognize the same architecture because it is the foundation of mainstream adventure cinema. The difference is the level of complexity. The Dino movie does not need to become grim to feel mature. It needs to become more precise. That precision shows up in character dynamics too. The pups function best when their personalities create different responses to the same problem. A rescue team becomes interesting when its members disagree about approach, even if the disagreement is gentle. One character wants to rush in. Another wants to gather information. Another improvises. Another panics. Another provides emotional support. These differences turn a collection of branded mascots into an ensemble. The audience already knows the characters, so the film does not have to spend enormous amounts of time introducing them. Instead, it can let personality drive action. That is a gift of franchise storytelling when used well. Familiarity creates efficiency. Efficiency creates room for escalation. The viewer does not need to wonder who these characters are. The viewer can focus on what happens when these characters are placed somewhere new. That is why the prehistoric setting works as a stress test. Familiar characters are more revealing when their environment changes. Skye is still Skye, but what does Skye's personality mean when the sky is filled with unfamiliar terrain and massive creatures? Rocky is still Rocky, but what does resourcefulness look like when there is no convenient piece of modern infrastructure to repurpose? Chase is still the disciplined leader, but what happens when the situation cannot be controlled through ordinary procedure? These are small questions, but small questions are enough to make a preschool franchise feel narratively alive. The movie also understands that humor can function as emotional pressure release. Dinosaurs are inherently intimidating because of their scale, so the film needs comedy to prevent the spectacle from becoming exhausting. That is where the pups' physical personalities become valuable. A stumble, a startled reaction, an overconfident plan, or a perfectly timed misunderstanding can reset the emotional temperature. The adult viewer might recognize the structure as classic action comedy pacing. The child simply knows that the scary part has become funny again. Both reactions are valid. In fact, that may be one of the most important lessons about children's entertainment. Emotional sophistication does not require emotional heaviness. A story can teach resilience without becoming miserable. It can acknowledge fear without wallowing in it. It can make danger exciting while preserving the child's sense that the world is fundamentally safe. The Dino movie works best when it understands that boundary. It wants the audience to feel the size of the dinosaurs without making children feel powerless. The pups can be small, but they are not helpless. They can be frightened, but they are not abandoned. They can make mistakes, but the story does not define them by those mistakes. That leads directly to the franchise's most complicated figure, Ryder. Ryder is one of the strangest protagonists in modern children's entertainment because he represents an almost impossible fantasy of childhood competence. He is young enough to belong emotionally with the pups, yet capable enough to command a sophisticated rescue organization. He knows how to operate technology. He understands logistics. He assigns roles. He communicates under pressure. He rarely appears genuinely overwhelmed. For a child watching, Ryder is not merely a leader. He is proof that being young does not have to mean being powerless. That is an appealing idea, and it explains part of the character's longevity. Adults often forget how frustrating childhood dependence can feel. You cannot drive. You cannot make major decisions. You cannot always choose where you go or what happens next. Adults control the schedule. Adults decide when you can stay up. Adults tell you when something is dangerous. Then a character like Ryder appears and says, "Actually, you can be the person everyone relies on." That is fantasy fuel. But there is another side to it. Ryder's competence is so extreme that it can become psychologically strange. He is a child who appears to have skipped most of childhood's uncertainty. He does not spend much time asking whether he is qualified. He does not have a normal adult mentor standing beside him to absorb responsibility. He is simply there, and the world accepts his authority. For a preschool audience, that may be empowering. For an adult viewer, it can feel almost dystopian. Why is this child responsible for everything? Why does everyone trust him? Why does he never seem to have a day off? The joke becomes clearer when you look at the franchise's larger fantasy. Paw Patrol is not really imagining children becoming independent in ordinary life. It is imagining children becoming useful. That is a subtle but important distinction. Ryder's value comes from competence. The pup's value comes from competence. Every character has a job. Everyone contributes. Everyone is needed. That is comforting because it gives the child a place in the social machine. You do not have to be the strongest person. You can be the one who knows how to fix something. You can be the one who flies. You can be the one who builds. You can be the one who communicates. The franchise therefore turns specialization into identity. That can be healthy when the story also allows characters to fail, rest, or ask for help. The more concerning version is the idea that worth comes from constant usefulness. Ryder is so competent that he risks becoming an impossible standard. A child watching may not consciously think, "I need to be like Ryder," but stories teach through emotional association. They show what gets rewarded. Ryder gets trust because he is capable. The pups get praise because they complete missions. Problems disappear because the team performs. It is a beautiful fantasy, but it is also a fantasy worth examining. The Dino movie has an opportunity to complicate that model because dinosaurs introduce situations where knowledge is incomplete. Prehistoric environments cannot always be solved by having the right gadget. The team must observe, adapt, and sometimes admit uncertainty. That is a healthier model of competence. Real competence is not knowing everything. It is knowing how to respond when you do not know. The difference is subtle, but it matters. A child does not need to learn that heroes never fail. A child needs to learn that failure does not end the story. If Ryder's role evolves toward that understanding, the character becomes more interesting. Leadership stops being about always having the answer and becomes about creating enough trust for the team to find an answer together. That is a much more realistic model, and it also makes the ensemble stronger. The pups are not simply extensions of Ryder's plan. They are specialists whose perspectives can challenge the plan. When a leader listens, competence becomes collaborative rather than authoritarian. That distinction is especially valuable for young viewers because it quietly reframes what leadership means. You do not have to be the loudest person. You do not have to know everything. You have to help people do what they are capable of doing. The irony is that Ryder's apparent perfection makes moments of uncertainty more powerful. When the supposedly unstoppable leader hesitates, the audience notices. When he asks for help, the moment has weight. When a pup solves a problem that Ryder did not anticipate, the story gives the child permission to imagine competence outside the established hierarchy. That is where the franchise can grow up without becoming cynical. It can keep the fantasy of capability while acknowledging that capability is not the same as control. And that distinction becomes even more important when the film's soundscape begins to change. The visual tension is undeniable, but it is the shift in the acoustic landscape that forces our brains to accept this as cinema rather than television. Sound is one of the easiest things to underestimate in animation because viewers tend to notice images first. But listen closely to the difference between a short-form preschool episode and a theatrical adventure. Television often needs immediate musical recognition. A theme song must identify the brand. A transition cue must tell the child what emotional state is coming next. The music is functional, memorable, and repetitive by design. A feature film has different responsibilities. It can allow themes to develop. It can use silence. It can create anticipation before the visual event occurs. It can let an orchestral swell turn a simple vehicle launch into a declaration of importance. The Dino movie understands that sound is part of the scale upgrade. Brass instruments can make the pups' vehicles feel heavier. Low percussion can suggest an approaching dinosaur before we see it. Strings can create anxiety without requiring dialogue to explain that something is wrong. A recurring musical motif can associate a character with courage, uncertainty, or discovery. Suddenly the same pup who looked like a toy on television can feel like a cinematic protagonist because the soundtrack tells your nervous system to take the moment seriously. That is not manipulation in a negative sense. It is the fundamental language of filmmaking. Sound tells us how to interpret images. Consider the reveal of a dinosaur. The visual alone might be impressive, but the audio design determines whether the creature feels majestic, terrifying, funny, or mysterious. A deep rumble can make the creature seem enormous. A sudden silence can make the audience lean forward. A sharp musical accent can transform the reveal into a joke. The same image can produce completely different emotions depending on what the soundtrack does around it. For a franchise built from toy-like imagery, this becomes especially important. The music creates a bridge between plastic familiarity and cinematic awe. It tells the audience that this is no longer just another episode. This matters because nostalgia is partly auditory. You can forget a plot and still remember a theme song. You can forget the name of an episode and still recognize the rhythm of its opening. Sound bypasses some of the analytical parts of memory. A few notes can bring back a room. A voice can bring back a television. A particular musical texture can bring back the feeling of being younger than you are now. That makes the Dino movie's orchestral ambition emotionally significant for adults. The soundtrack does not merely make the movie bigger. It can activate the old memory while placing it inside a new emotional context. You hear something familiar, but it has more weight. The sensation can be strangely bittersweet. You recognize the franchise, but you also recognize that you are no longer the same audience. This is where the film's sound design becomes thematic rather than merely technical. The story is about pups confronting a prehistoric world, but the emotional experience for adults is partly about confronting time. The dinosaurs represent deep time on screen. The soundtrack represents remembered time in your head. Those two ideas meet. A familiar character theme can play over an enormous prehistoric landscape, and suddenly the movie is connecting your earliest media memories with a world that existed millions of years before any of us. That contrast is almost poetic. The tiny plastic figure becomes part of a huge cinematic frame. The preschool theme becomes part of an orchestral score. The Saturday morning ritual becomes a theatrical event. The franchise is literally putting childhood inside a larger soundstage. The emotional impact can be stronger than expected because adults are often unprepared for nostalgia that arrives through something they once considered trivial. We expect to become emotional when we revisit a beloved classic. We do not always expect a preschool franchise to trigger the same response. But memory does not care about critical prestige. Your brain does not ask whether a movie was culturally important before attaching a feeling to it. If Paw Patrol was present during a meaningful period of your life, then it is meaningful. That does not make every episode good. It does not mean the franchise deserves immunity from criticism. It means the emotional association is real. And that is why dismissing the entire property as a corporate toy machine misses something important. The corporate machine may explain why the property was everywhere. It does not explain what specific memory you formed while watching it. That part belongs to you. The same distinction becomes crucial when we talk about critical reception and commercial performance. Preschool intellectual property occupies a strange place in popular culture. Critics are often hesitant to treat it as serious cinema because the intended audience is so young and the commercial machinery is so visible. A movie can be technically impressive and still be described as content. It can have carefully designed animation, sophisticated sound, skilled voice performances, and effective pacing, yet the cultural conversation may reduce it to whether parents can tolerate 90 minutes of branded entertainment. That criticism is understandable. Adults have limited time. There is a huge amount of children's content competing for attention. And some franchise movies genuinely are cynical. But the dismissal can become too broad. When people say that preschool movies do not matter, they are confusing artistic prestige with cultural impact. A movie does not need to be aimed at adults to become foundational. For millions of children, these characters are among their first recurring fictional companions. Their first heroes are not necessarily superheroes or literary characters. They may be animated animals who arrive on television every morning and repeat the same reassuring pattern. That makes the franchise part of a child's media literacy. The child learns how stories work through these characters. They learn that problems have beginnings, middles, and endings. They learn that different characters can have different strengths. They learn that cooperation matters. They learn that danger can be represented without being overwhelming. They learn visual recognition, emotional vocabulary, and narrative expectation. None of that makes Paw Patrol automatically profound, but it makes it culturally consequential. Box office numbers also need context. A theatrical family movie does not compete for exactly the same reasons as an adult drama. Families make different decisions about moviegoing. A parent may choose a film because the child recognizes the characters. The child may choose it because a trailer contains a dinosaur. Another parent may see it because they want an activity everyone can share. The franchise begins with an enormous awareness advantage. That can look like pure commercial gravity, but it also reflects years of accumulated cultural presence. A new original animated film has to introduce its characters. Paw Patrol does not. It walks into the theater carrying years of recognition. That is commercially powerful, but it is also narratively useful. Familiarity allows the filmmakers to spend their limited time expanding the world instead of rebuilding the entire premise. The real question, then, is whether the movie uses that inherited attention responsibly. Does it offer enough invention to justify the ticket? Does it create something that feels different from television? Does it reward the adult who came along? Does it respect the child's attachment rather than treating it as a marketing vulnerability? Those questions are more useful than simply asking whether critics liked it. A film can be commercially successful and artistically lazy. It can also be commercially engineered and artistically competent. The categories overlap more often than we like to admit. The entertainment industry has always produced art inside commercial systems. Disney, Pixar, DreamWorks, and countless other studios have built extraordinary works while selling merchandise, tickets, subscriptions, and experiences. The presence of a business model does not automatically invalidate the art. The better question is what the artists manage to create inside that system. Paw Patrol is particularly interesting because the commercial identity is so visible. You can see the toy before you see the movie. The vehicle exists as a product. The character exists as a product. The logo exists as a product. That transparency makes it harder to pretend the film is pure artistic expression. But perhaps we do not need to pretend. Maybe the more honest analysis is that modern children's cinema is a form of commercial folklore. It is made by companies, shaped by markets, and experienced by children as mythology. That contradiction is not a bug. It is the defining condition. The child does not care about quarterly revenue. The child cares that Chase showed up. The adult sees the merchandising wall. The child sees the world they love. Both perceptions can be true at the same time. And this is where the film's cultural footprint becomes more fascinating than any individual review score. A critic watches Paw Patrol, the Dino movie once and evaluates it. A child may encounter Paw Patrol for years. The cultural footprint is therefore cumulative. It is built from episodes, toys, birthday parties, clothing, songs, books, games, and family routines. The movie becomes one more layer in an existing memory. That is why the original audience's age matters so much. The people who first encountered Paw Patrol as very young children are growing up. Some are now old enough to remember the franchise with genuine nostalgia. Others may have moved beyond it but still recognize the theme song immediately. And parents who introduced the franchise to younger children are experiencing a different kind of time travel. They may be watching the same characters with their own children that they once watched with younger siblings. The franchise becomes a bridge between generations. That bridge can be comforting, but it can also be unsettling. Because while the pups remain almost permanently young, the audience does not. That is the mirror at the heart of the entire franchise. If you sat through this movie as an adult and felt a strange, inexplicable lump in your throat, you are not going crazy. You are mourning the speed at which time moves. The pups are still there. Their faces have not aged. Their voices may change, their environments may expand, their vehicles may become more sophisticated, but the characters remain functionally frozen. You are the one who moved. That can create a very specific kind of nostalgia. It is not nostalgia for a particular story. It is nostalgia for the version of yourself who needed that story. Maybe you remember sitting too close to the television. Maybe you remember a toy vehicle being your favorite possession for a few months. Maybe you remember a younger sibling demanding the same episode over and over. Maybe you remember pretending to conduct rescues with figures on the living room floor. Those memories can feel embarrassingly small when you describe them to another adult. But small memories are often the ones that make up a childhood. Not every formative experience is a dramatic event. Sometimes it is a Saturday morning routine repeated so many times that you stop noticing it until decades later, when a familiar theme song suddenly returns and you realize the room is gone, the television is gone, the toys are gone, and you are not that child anymore. That realization is painful precisely because nothing terrible happened. Childhood simply ended. There was no announcement. No final episode of your own childhood aired to tell you that the era was over. One day you just stopped watching. The next year brought a different show. Then school became more serious. Friends changed. Your interests changed. The toy disappeared into a drawer. Eventually the drawer disappeared too. Paw Patrol continued without you. That is one of the strangest things about children's media. The franchise is designed to remain stable while its audience cycles through. Every generation gets its own relationship with the same characters. The child feels like the characters belong to them, even though the franchise was there before and will likely be there after. That creates a peculiar illusion of permanence. The pups feel eternal because they are designed not to age. But the viewer becomes a historical document. Your relationship with the franchise tells you something about where you were in time. For adults who grew up around the 2010s and early 2020s, the franchise can represent a particular media environment, streaming alongside television, toys discovered through online videos, characters appearing across platforms, parents navigating algorithmic children's content, and children developing media habits in a world that is more connected and more fragmented than the one previous generations knew. The Dino movie therefore belongs to a changing media ecosystem. It is not simply a sequel. It is evidence of how children's entertainment has evolved. The original Paw Patrol model emerged when linear television and physical toys still worked together in a familiar way. The newer generation encounters characters through streaming services, clips, apps, games, social platforms, and recommendation systems. The franchise has had to become more than a show because the audience's attention has become more fragmented. That makes the cinematic expansion more understandable. A theatrical event offers something that a random online clip cannot: collective attention. For a child, going to the theater can transform a familiar franchise into an event. The characters are suddenly huge. The sound surrounds you. The room is dark. Other people are laughing. The child experiences the property as cinema rather than background media. For adults, that can be strangely moving because you recognize the old characters inside a completely different ritual. You may have watched Paw Patrol on a small television. Your child may see it projected across an enormous screen. Same pups. Different world. That is the generational transition in miniature. And it is why the film's nostalgia should not belong only to people who were there at the beginning. The earliest audiences may feel the strongest sense of time passing, but the newer generation is building its own memories right now. A parent watching their child laugh at a dinosaur sequence may be remembering their own favorite childhood movie. An older sibling may be remembering the toy they used to mock but secretly played with. A young adult may discover that the franchise they once considered annoying has become part of the cultural landscape they grew up in. Nostalgia is rarely clean. It contains affection, embarrassment, loss, and distance all at once. You can love something and still recognize its flaws. You can laugh at how commercial it was and still feel protective of the child who loved it. You can criticize the writing and still become emotional when the music starts. Those reactions do not cancel one another out. They coexist because adulthood allows you to hold contradictory truths. That is what balanced criticism should do. It should not tell you that your childhood favorite was secretly a masterpiece simply because you remember it fondly. But it should also not tell you that your emotional response is stupid because the property was designed to sell toys. Both extremes are too easy. The more interesting position is somewhere in the middle. Paw Patrol can be commercial. It can be repetitive. It can be engineered for recognition. And it can still produce genuine affection, technically competent filmmaking, and meaningful childhood memories. The question is whether the Dino movie transforms those contradictions into something worthwhile. Its answer is imperfect, but surprisingly compelling. The film does not escape the machinery that produced it. It does not suddenly become an independent art film. The branding remains visible. The characters remain products as well as personalities. The story still has to support an enormous ecosystem of recognition. But within those constraints, the filmmakers find room for genuine craft. The dinosaurs give the visual department a chance to experiment with scale. The cinematic format gives the editors room to build longer sequences. The score gives the composers room to develop motifs. The script can create layers for adults without abandoning preschool clarity. The characters can confront environments that challenge their established roles. None of these innovations erase the commercial foundation. They simply demonstrate that commercial foundations can support better or worse artistic outcomes. That distinction matters because we often talk about commercial children's entertainment as if it were a binary choice: either the movie is a soulless cash grab or it is secretly a misunderstood masterpiece. Most movies are neither. They are collaborations shaped by budgets, deadlines, audience expectations, corporate strategy, creative ambition, technical limitations, and the strange alchemy of performance. Paw Patrol, the Dino movie, lives in that messy middle. It is a product. It is also a film. It is a piece of corporate strategy. It is also a memory object. It is designed for children. It is also aware that adults are sitting beside them. It is visually engineered to sell an experience. It is also capable of creating genuine wonder. Those truths do not need to be reconciled by pretending one is false. They need to be held together. That is the central lesson of the franchise's evolution. The old plastic aesthetic was not merely something to escape. It was the foundation. The bright colors, simple roles, recognizable vehicles, and reassuring rescues created a visual and emotional vocabulary that children could understand immediately. The cinematic expansion did not replace that vocabulary. It translated it into a larger grammar. The pups became cinematic characters without becoming unrecognizable. Their vehicles became action machines without losing their toy-like clarity. Their world became more detailed without becoming inaccessible. The dinosaurs became spectacular without eliminating the franchise's fundamental emotional promise. When things get frightening, the team shows up. When the problem becomes too big, everyone contributes. When the world becomes unfamiliar, familiar relationships become anchors. That is why the movie's apparent simplicity can conceal a surprisingly sophisticated structure. It is not sophisticated because it contains adult themes in disguise. It is sophisticated because it understands how to use familiarity as a foundation for escalation. The audience does not need to learn who the pups are. The movie can therefore spend its energy showing what happens when the familiar characters enter unfamiliar territory. That is a powerful storytelling advantage. And it helps explain why the dinosaur premise feels emotionally larger than another city rescue would. Dinosaurs are symbols of a world that cannot be controlled. They represent change on a scale beyond individual competence. They remind us that every civilization, every city, every character, and every audience eventually becomes part of history. In a strange way, that makes them perfect companions for a franchise about growing up. The pups do not age, but the world around them does. The original audience does. The technology does. The animation does. The distribution model does. The cultural conversation does. The toys become collectibles. The theme song becomes nostalgia. The movie becomes a timestamp. That is why the film can feel bittersweet even when the story itself is cheerful. You are watching a childhood object become an artifact while it is still alive. And perhaps that is the most honest way to judge Paw Patrol, the Dino movie. Do not ask whether it deserves the same cultural status as the animated films that defined your own childhood. That comparison is unfair because every generation has its own emotional geography. Instead, ask what this movie means to the children who will remember it. Will they remember the dinosaur chase? Will they remember the theater? Will they remember the toy they brought home? Will they remember sitting beside a parent or sibling? Will a particular musical cue become attached to a particular year of their lives? Those are the questions that determine legacy more than reviews do. A critic can evaluate animation quality. A studio can measure ticket sales. A retailer can measure toy demand. But childhood memory operates on another system entirely. It measures meaning through association. A movie becomes important because of where you were when you saw it. That is why the cultural footprint of children's entertainment is so difficult to calculate. The numbers can tell us how many people watched. They cannot tell us how many bedrooms contained a toy. They cannot tell us how many children practiced rescue missions on the carpet. They cannot tell us how many parents smiled despite hearing the same song for the 50th time because their child was happy. They cannot tell us how many adults will hear that song 15 years later and suddenly remember being younger. Commercial data can describe reach. It cannot describe attachment. And attachment is where modern commercial myth-making becomes unexpectedly human. The corporation creates a repeatable icon. The audience gives it a life beyond the transaction. That is the paradox. The machine wants a product. The child wants a friend. The parent wants 30 minutes of manageable entertainment. The adult viewer wants to understand why they still care. The filmmaker wants to make the sequence work. The composer wants the brass to hit at exactly the right moment. The animator wants the dinosaur to feel heavy. The toy designer wants the vehicle silhouette to remain recognizable. All of these motivations overlap. Sometimes they produce something hollow. Sometimes they produce something genuinely affecting. The Dino movie is most interesting when the latter emerges from the former. That is where we arrive at the final judgment. Paw Patrol, the Dino movie, does not overthrow the commercial logic of preschool entertainment. It perfects and expands it. It takes a franchise built around bright colors, simple roles, reliable rescues, and extremely recognizable products and asks how far that language can stretch before it stops feeling like Paw Patrol. The answer is farther than you might expect. The visual world can become more sophisticated without losing clarity. The stakes can become larger without becoming frightening. The soundtrack can become cinematic without abandoning playfulness. The characters can remain simple while their relationships become more meaningful. The result is not revolutionary in the traditional sense. It is evolutionary. And that distinction is important. The film is not trying to reinvent children's cinema. It is showing what happens when a commercial children's property becomes old enough to inherit a history. The franchise has accumulated memories, expectations, technology, and audiences. Its newest movie therefore carries more weight than its premise suggests. It is the product of a system that has learned what children recognize, what parents tolerate, what theaters need, what toys can reinforce, and what visual language can scale. But it is also the product of artists who have to make those constraints work. That is why calling it nothing more than a cash grab feels incomplete. Cash grabs do not automatically become memorable. Commercial strategy can guarantee exposure. It cannot guarantee affection. It can put a character in front of millions of children. It cannot determine which child hugs the toy at bedtime. It can create a soundtrack. It cannot choose which adult later hears the melody and remembers a family member who is now grown. It can manufacture the object. It cannot manufacture the exact memory. That memory belongs to the audience. And if you were one of the people who grew up with these pups, your nostalgia makes sense. You do not need to defend every creative choice. You do not need to pretend every episode was brilliant. You do not need to apologize for caring about something designed for toddlers. Childhood is not a critical review. It is a collection of sensations. A color. A voice. A theme song. A toy in your hand. A couch. A morning. A sibling. A parent nearby. The franchise becomes part of that constellation. The Dino movie simply gives those old associations a new frame. It makes the world bigger, which makes the characters smaller, which makes their courage more visible. It makes the sound bigger, which makes the old melodies feel more distant and more familiar at the same time. It makes the environment more detailed, which makes the simple characters feel almost like figures from a remembered dream. And it gives adults a strange opportunity to watch the audience they once were and the audience they have become sitting in the same room. That is the real milestone here. Not the dinosaur technology. Not the box office. Not the toy line. The milestone is that a franchise once associated almost entirely with early childhood has reached the point where its earliest viewers can look back and recognize themselves in it. The pups have not grown up. We have. The television did not announce the transition. The toys did not announce it. Life simply kept moving, and one day the same bright blue appeared on a giant screen and felt different. Maybe that is why this movie can work as a generational artifact even when it remains unmistakably commercial. It captures a moment when preschool entertainment is no longer just something children consume. It is something generations remember. The child sees an adventure. The parent sees an afternoon together. The older viewer sees a piece of the past. The industry sees a franchise continuing to evolve. And the film itself sits at the intersection of all four perspectives. So where does that leave us? Standing between a corporate balance sheet and a genuine childhood memory. It is tempting to choose one side. Either celebrate the franchise as innocent nostalgia or condemn it as industrialized marketing. But the truth is more uncomfortable and more interesting. Paw Patrol is both. It is a commercial machine that learned how to become emotionally significant. It is a toy pipeline that accidentally became part of people's personal histories. It is preschool entertainment that discovered cinematic ambition. It is a set of characters designed not to age, surrounded by an audience that cannot stop aging. That contradiction is not something the movie solves. It is something the movie reveals. And perhaps that is why the Dino movie feels like a generational milestone. It demonstrates how modern children's entertainment can function as folklore even when everyone involved knows it is a business. Folklore has always been shaped by systems. Stories are repeated because they are useful. Characters survive because people retell them. Symbols become powerful because generations attach meaning to them. Paw Patrol operates through a modern technological version of the same process. The repetition happens through streaming. The physical artifacts come through retail. The stories travel through television and cinema. The characters appear in toys, clothing, games, books, and digital spaces. The mythology is distributed across an ecosystem. Yet the emotional result can still be deeply personal. That is the strange achievement. The franchise does not need to become less commercial to become meaningful. It needs to create enough space inside the commercial structure for people to project their own lives onto it. The Dino movie provides that space through scale, nostalgia, and change. It gives children something new to discover while giving adults something old to recognize. It allows the franchise to move forward without pretending the past never happened. And that is why the final feeling is not triumph or condemnation. It is reconciliation. You can look at the toy shelf and see the business. You can look at the child holding the toy and see the memory. You can look at the movie screen and see the technical labor. You can look at the face of a child watching it and see wonder. All of those things can exist simultaneously. The adult mistake is assuming that understanding the machinery destroys the magic. Sometimes understanding the machinery makes the magic more interesting. You begin to appreciate how many people had to coordinate for a simple image to feel effortless. You notice the lighting. You hear the score. You understand the timing. You see the scale contrast. You recognize the writing layers. And then you remember that none of those technical explanations were necessary for the child. The child simply saw a dinosaur and a pup and believed, for a moment, that this world was real. That belief is not foolish. It is the fundamental power of storytelling. Maybe that is the final lesson of Paw Patrol, the Dino movie. Childhood entertainment does not have to be profound to matter. It has to be present. It has to arrive at the right time and become attached to the rhythms of a life. Years later, the meaning can change. The thing that once seemed disposable can become a time capsule. The movie that once belonged to someone else's child can become part of your own history. The toy you left behind can become evidence that you were once smaller, less cynical, and more willing to believe that every problem had a rescue team waiting around the corner. There is something beautiful about that, even if the packaging had a logo on it. And maybe that is where the next rescue begins. Not on a prehistoric island, not in Adventure City, and not inside another perfectly engineered mission. It begins with the memories we carry after the screen goes dark. Think about the toys you left behind. Maybe yours were Paw Patrol figures. Maybe they were dinosaurs, superheroes, dolls, action figures, building sets, or some other brightly colored collection that once seemed like the most important possession in the world. Think about where those toys went. Maybe they are still in a box somewhere. Maybe a younger relative plays with them now. Maybe they disappeared years ago. Whatever happened to them, the strange thing is that you probably remember more than you expected. You remember the texture. You remember the colors. You remember the room. You remember who was there. You remember what being that age felt like. That is why modern commercial myth-making deserves a little more respect than we sometimes give it. Not because corporations deserve sentimental immunity, and not because every branded movie is secretly a masterpiece, but because culture is built from the things people actually live with. Children do not grow up exclusively on prestigious art. They grow up on repetition, toys, television, songs, characters, jokes, advertisements, playground games, family rituals, and whatever happens to capture their imagination. Those things become the raw material of memory. Paw Patrol is one piece of that enormous cultural landscape. The Dino movie simply gives us a chance to notice it. We can criticize the franchise's commercialism. We should. We can question its storytelling shortcuts. We should. We can discuss whether the cinematic scale is earned or merely another way to sell a larger experience. We should. But we can also admit when the craft works. We can appreciate the animation. We can notice the score. We can recognize the cleverness of the dual audience writing. We can understand why dinosaurs remain irresistible. We can acknowledge the emotional power of seeing familiar characters in unfamiliar worlds. And most importantly, we can allow ourselves to feel something without confusing emotion with critical surrender. It is okay to still love this. It is okay to outgrow it and still remember it fondly. It is okay to laugh at the merchandise and then feel unexpectedly emotional when the theme returns. It is okay to recognize the machine and still admire what happened inside it. Because the story of Paw Patrol is ultimately not the story of a corporation successfully selling rescue dogs. That is the business story. The human story is what happened after the sale. A child took the toy home. A family watched the show. A sibling learned the characters. A parent heard the theme song. A memory formed. Years passed. The child grew up. The pup stayed young. And eventually, that grown viewer sat in a dark theater and realized that the thing on the screen was not really asking them to become a child again. It was asking them to remember what it felt like to be one. That is a very different experience. You cannot go back to the bedroom. You cannot restore the old television. You cannot make time stop. But for the length of a movie, a familiar blue sky can open a door. A toy-like vehicle can cross the screen. A dinosaur can roar. A familiar voice can call the pups to action. And somewhere between the plastic and the pixels, the past and the present briefly overlap. The child who loved the toys is still there. The adult who watched them grow up is there too. Neither has to defeat the other. They can sit together, watch the movie, laugh at the ridiculous parts, appreciate the beautiful ones, question the commercial machinery, and still feel that little ache when the credits begin. That ache is not proof that the movie manipulated you successfully. It is proof that time did what time always does. It moved. The pups ran forward. You did too. And for once, the rescue was not about saving the world from disaster. It was about recognizing the piece of your own world that you thought you had left behind.